So this is exciting. We are here with our LGBTQIA2SP plus uh, review of some of the changes and vocabulary and ideas around discussing gender and being able to reach out and support folks in our community in ways that are helpful and just using current best practice terminology, recognizing that a lot of that has changed over recent years. And so, just to make sure that we are all speaking in the same language when it comes to equity, I want to bring up this acronym. Now, this is one of the more common from academic circles and in literary circles where we are doing scientific or survey data based writing. And the shorter version of this acronym, LGBT plus or LGBTQ plus, is one that you might hear in conversation more often. It is now emerging that more folks are using GSRM, which is gender, sexual, and romantic minority. There are a few other acronyms that are out there, but this does remain the most popular and most helpful. We know that the L is for lesbian, and that the G stands for gay, bi, bisexual, T is trans. Now, the L, fun fact, is first because when the acronym first started, it was GLBT or just GL. But that was actually switched with a lot of the organizations that after the gender revolution of the 70s, that we started seeing large organizations able to maneuver more safely in public spaces as being same gender loving was decriminalized in America, that we had the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And a lot of medical treatment was denied to people with HIV and AIDS as we learned more about it and as there was a great deal of fear as well as still discrimination. It wasn't just about hospitals, it was about that hospice centers, about that long term care centers, nursing homes would not accept individuals with HIV or AIDS. Because it was such an epidemic among gay men, who was there to offer that care? Well, a lot of family estrangement was incredibly common. So, where there was not family or long term partners to offer that care, lesbians across the country began opening their homes to their gay male friends. And it was very common that hospice centers, that homes converted into care spaces, or that lesbians willing to go into homes and offer the in-home care that home health care aides would not provide, was being done by members of the lesbian community. And so, as a sign of appreciation and gratitude for lesbian advocates, activists, and DIY healthcare aides where the medical care system did not show up, lesbians were a big part of gay men who were able to have care with dignity through the HIV and AIDS crisis of the 80s. And so the L was moved to the beginning of the acronym as a sign of respect. That's also important to know because many of us do partner with the medical community and the healthcare community. Healthcare outcomes are significantly lower for all of the letters of the acronym than those who are cisgender and heterosexual. And a big part of that is that there is a historic distrust of the medical community, a lot of which did spring from the HIV and AIDS crisis when care was denied. It also comes from the fact that biologically, members of the trans community have been told, according to your chromosomal makeup, according to what is on your birth certificate. That is how we will treat you and use use your information. So chosen names, pronouns, etc., have not historically had as much cultural competency in medical treatment spaces. And so there was a reluctance to go into those spaces unless deeply necessary. Also, it has been very much varied according to state or region. To date, as of right now, um, any medical training around LGBTQIAP plus individuals is still optional in almost every medical school or medical training facility. It is an elective. So there are a number of medical facilities that do not provide gender affirming care. So by that, I mean being able to write prescriptions for hormones, which do require accompanying blood tests, do require accompanying safety checks, and without knowing the effect of hormones on the body, knowing how to appropriately administer those tests or order those tests, being able to test an individual's heart function, kidney function, to know where there may be potential danger from hormone usage and being able to adjust levels if there are any warning signs. That training is not possessed by all medical professionals. It is an elective. So it is, quite frankly, not safe for every trans person, for every person who may be living with HIV or AIDS, for individuals who are using any level of hormone therapy or supplemental hormone care. Not all medical doctors, nurses, home health aides have knowledge of how to support that care. And so there has been a challenge in finding where can I go to have the appropriate prescriptions written, to get the appropriate blood tests, and to be able to just receive competent care. So those are real issues to just understand that particularly our trans and our folks living with HIV and AIDS are also dealing with. And our next letter after the LGB and T, we have Q, which can be queer or questioning, and the I, which is intersex. Now, a lot of folks are not aware that intersex is almost as common as having red hair or being left-handed. It is something that is not considered an identity. That is actually a old school, we'll say, scientific gender reality. Being intersex can be chromosomal, where you are born with XXY chromosomes or XYY chromosomes. It can be physiological, being born with ambiguous genitalia, both a penis and a vagina, a very small penis that might look like an enlarged clitoris. It's unclear visually whether it is a penis or a vagina. There are also folks who are gendered male at birth, but have larger chest that develop what resemble breasts. And so there's simply ambiguous secondary sex characteristics. And then we also have adrenal intersex folks who, when hormones kick in their adolescence, begin producing hormones that are traditionally male or female, right? So during the monthly cycle, there are 4 primary hormones that happen and occur in our bodies. Now, those who are gendered female at birth generally produce more estrogen and progesterone, and only trace amounts of androgen and testosterone. Whereas men produce more androgen and testosterone and very trace amounts of progesterone and estrogen. For intersex people, they produce all four on high volume all the time. The A is the ACE spectrum, asexual and aromantic. And the P is pansexual or polysexual. The plus, recognizing that a lot of the terminology continues to change. Now, what are some of the differences? Some of the things that have happened over the last few years. Lesbian has remained fairly consistent. Gay, we now use predominantly to refer to men, although it is an open term that anyone who is attracted to the same gender is considered gay. So women can be gay, men can be gay, but it is generally used to refer to men. Bisexual is now an umbrella term, meaning there are multiple identities under the bisexual umbrella. Bisexual has historically been interpreted to mean I am attracted to both males and females. But we now realize there's more than two genders. So bisexual simply means attracted to two or more genders. And there are folks who consider being pan or polysexual, having attraction to multiple genders or attraction to all genders. If you don't see the P on the acronym, if it's just LGBTQ or LGBTQIA, pansexual and polysexual are considered under the bisexual umbrella. So the pansexual and polysexual attracted to all genders or attracted to multiple genders are always present. They're just sometimes considered part of bisexual as a more inclusive term. Trans used to refer to the word transsexual, which or transgender and transsexual, because transgender, gender located in the mind, and transsexual, sex being located as what are their sex organs, what's happening in your underwear, right? That is now no longer considered best practice. There are so many reasons that people do not have gender affirming surgery or gender confirming surgery. It is expensive, it can be dangerous. It just may not be accessible for religious reasons, for family reasons, for physical safety. So we also recognize that creating a competition or a difference in status and a lack of equity between those who have had surgery and those who haven't, that wasn't a helpful way of dividing folks in the trans community. So transsexual is not a word you will frequently hear used anymore. Unless someone identifies themselves as transsexual, that's just not a word we say. We have blessed and released that to the annals of history. We are transgender, and transgender folks may have surgical confirmation, they may use hormone therapy, they may simply have the identity that exists in brain and spirit without having external confirmation. All are equally trans and equally valid. And so trans is just trans, or if we want to use the full word, transgender. But transsexual, that one's gone. Q, a lot of folks do not consider questioning to be part of the Q. Others do. There is not a singular consensus on whether or not those in discernment are, that's what the acronym stands for or not. I always default to let's be as inclusive as possible, but you will hear different answers in different spaces. So I just lift that up. Queer is very much an umbrella term that includes all of the identities. That which is different from the predominant um, models in contemporary society of what has been historically acceptable. So, lesbian, bisexual, gay, trans, all of these fall under queer, as is what is different from the predominant majority. And queer is just an important word because historically it has been such a significant slur and was used in a very harmful, painful way. So, queer, again, is a word we don't lead with, particularly if we are talking to individuals who are um, old enough to remember the 80s and before. For those that were born in the 90s and the 2000s, they generally don't have a lot of personal experience with queer being used as an insult. But those who were alive and cognizant in the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, they have very strong memories and generally experiences of queer being an insult. And so they do not identify and have not participated in the reclaiming of this word. So let folks identify themselves as queer before using it to describe someone, particularly if they are of a more advanced age. And the ACE spectrum, so asexual is with minimal or without sexual desire. Um, might still occasionally have sex, um, may have and frequently do have very loving romantic relationships, may be married, may be partnered, just not interested in the sexual part because of a lack of sexual attraction. Um, Asexual is not the same as a romantic. A romantic are individuals who experience friendship and experience being drawn to people in a way that is not romantic. So they may have sexual desires as a way of satisfying their physical needs, but are not necessarily interested in romantic partnerships. Now, there are plenty of other words that would fill the screen that are part of the aromantic or the asexual spectrum. For example, there are folks who are demisexual or demiromantic. They experience some romantic attraction or some sexual attraction, but not as much as the general population. So they are demi-romantic. There are those who are what's considered sapiosexual or sapio-romantic. They are attracted to the human and require some level of intellectual connection rather than having that biological urge for romantic partnership or sexual connection. They require a level of comfort and safety and intellectual stimulation or partnership. And so they just experience romantic and sexual attraction in a very different way. So we have are asexual and aromantic. We have demisexual and demiromantic, which can also be referred to as gray sexual or gray romantic, right? It's not black or white. It's more in the middle, combination of both. So demisexual, demiromantic, gray sexual, gray romantic, sapiosexual, sapioromantic. Folks may use those interchangeably. They have slightly different nuances, but that's why very much the importance of the ask matters. How would you prefer to identify yourself? What phrasing would you prefer I use? Um, is there a specific label or letter or definition that you find most helpful? Because everybody's going to give you a different answer. And some folks are arrow and ace. And so they even have their own flag for arrow ace. I do not have sexual or romantic attraction, but there are folks who are on the arrow spectrum or who are on the ace spectrum and are just one or the other. And then we also have agender, moves away from the sexuality, the relationship spectrum, and into gender identity. right? Because non-binary is I am not the extreme of male or female, but somewhere on the spectrum in between. And so non-binary folks may lean more masculine, may lean more feminine, may consider themselves having aspects of both male and female, or may say I am equally both, or I am outside that spectrum. Some people use agender and non-binary in similar ways. Again, each person's going to define it for themselves slightly differently. Learn the art of the ask. Non-binary is the more common term. Agender is less frequently used, but they are two different terms. Agender, not having any relationship to male or female. Non-binary may be defined by having different percentages or existing on a spectrum between masculinity and femininity. So trans is an umbrella term. It involves the trans identity, also the non-binary identity, and there are, again, some more phrases. Pangender. I am not slightly less masculine or slightly less feminine. I'm fully masculine and fully feminine. I just contain them both. As Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes, right? So we have pangender, we have genderqueer. I just embody gender differently. So the trans community, you might have folks refer to themselves as pangender, as gender fluid, gender flexible, gender queer, as non-binary. All of these are considered under the trans umbrella. Gender fluid, gender flexible may have different expression on a day-to-day basis because there's simply, I contain multitudes. And the same way that we might dress differently or carry ourselves differently in different spaces and on different days, when you have that capacity for gender fluidity or flexibility or being gender queer, not relating to gender in the same way, you may even use different names, different pronouns on different days, right? So our pangender siblings may have different names and pronouns they use in different spaces. That's part of the identity. Two-spirit is a special note. Many people do not consider two-spirit to be part of the trans community, because it is specifically referring to a third gender that is specific to Native American communities. The reason why we don't use 2S, because for a lot of years that was up there, right? Was LGBTQIA2S or LGBTQIA2SP. But there's enough pushback now from Native American communities that say, we are not monolithic. We are not all the same. And to use something that is a translation invented by white people and a translation that is for the comfort and ease of English speakers is not actually a way of being more helpful for Native American people. So rather than using two-spirit, unless it is something that is named by the individual, we use whatever the actual term is from their tribal language. And if you are not Native American, if you are not part of that tribe, we do not say we are two-spirit. Two-spirit is only a Native American reality. Why? Because it is considered a spiritual reality, a spiritual identity. That is, as God has no gender, as God contains all genders, as the Great Spirit contains all genders, Humans who contain all genders are more like the Great Spirit, are closer to the Great Spirit, may serve as holy people, sacred people, or shamans in their tribe. A non binary person is not necessarily a spiritual, sacred being in the predominant religion or a shaman. So, two spirit and non binary, or two spirit and trans, are not considered the same thing. So, that's why two spirit is generally not considered part of the trans community, even though it might seem like gender queer, gender fluid, gender flexible, pangender. Okay. Now, for those who are with us live, everything that I'm using today is public domain so that you can use it to your helpful adoration of your adoring public. And I will put links to all of the things that I use today in the chat to make that easier for you. One of the terms that is frequently used more historically is the word homosexual, where homo um, being the same as opposed to hetero being different. Um, Homosexual is not a no, 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 don't say it. It's just considered outdated, right? Because again, it focuses very much on what is more limiting who your sexual attraction is to, and as we have had more expansive and shifting definitions of who an individual are, we have more words that say, this is my reality, and fewer words, as you notice, that say, this is who I'm attracted to. And so homosexual has simply drifted into disuse. But it is not something that is generally considered harmful or offensive, just not as useful. So um, for the sake of the beauty of video, I am going to share another slide that may be helpful because it gives much more concise definitions. What do some of these terms mean? There are some folks, and I want to lift up a couple of things on here. You will hear some individuals refer to themselves as trans man or trans woman, a transgender female, a transgender male. Again, this is something that people should self-identify as. It's just not really our business what you were gendered at birth, um, how you identify now. And a lot more trans folks will simply say, I'm a man or I'm a woman, I'm male or I'm female. Others lean stronger into the trans identity and they say, I'm trans. And they don't need to define it according to a binary, I'm a trans man or I'm a trans woman, because they may be pangender, right? They may not be one or the other. So we respect it. If someone says, I'm a trans man, I'm a trans woman, but that's not what we lead with anymore. If someone is trans or not, if they're a male or a female, they're just a male or a female. It is very important that we don't codify or qualify what type of man are you? What type of woman are you? You are simply male or female. That's it. Unless someone says, I'm trans, in which case they can just be trans because they may not identify in that binary, or they may be trans outside of that binary. Another term is TNG. Some folks who, rather than using the word trans, will say transgender, non-binary, and or gender diverse. This is more often used in nonprofits, in academic institutions, where we're looking for a safe space or a gathering of folks. You know, this is a safe space for TNG folks. So if it is specifically to be a safe space or an inclusive space for folks under the trans umbrella, then we might say TNG instead of trans, because it lets folks know this is an inclusive space for all the identities under the trans and the non-binary, and the gender diverse umbrella. So if you're gender fluid, gender flexible, gender queer, pangender, um, you absolutely are welcome in this space, whether you use a trans label or not. So, what about the rest of the world? We've talked a lot about what is most common in America, and we did talk about that we recognize that there are more than just the genders male and female, because we know that being intersex is a reality in terms of every way, chromosomes and hormones and all the things. But then, how did this idea of there's only men and women, male and female, become so widespread? Well, it turns out that's actually a fairly modern concept, and it is not one that is universally practiced. Say what? Turns out there's multiple countries and communities that have more than two genders. For example, in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, the hijra, it's a third gender that exists that is, what we might consider or label as non binary or bigender or pangender, but includes aspects of masculine and feminine. But that has been a historical reality for so long. Those who are hijra are considered a third gender, an official legal third gender in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. In Samoa, we have the fa'afafine. It translates to in the manner of a woman, and it is men who take on those who are gendered male at birth, those who are born with penises, who live and assume the roles in society as women. And because the society of Samoans is more highly gendered, rather than masculine people being stigmatized for conducting themselves in more feminine ways, it is considered that there is actually a real difference in the brain, in the body, and that those who are gendered male at birth but feel called to identify with more feminine ways of being are actually a different gender. It's a different type of folks who are gendered male at birth. They are born male, but called to live and act in the manner of a woman. And the fa'afafine, considered a third gender, absolutely officially recognized as a third gender. Um, the mahu in Hawaii, both male and female traits, and would be considered more like gender fluid in America, often move between male and female, right? I love that in Thailand, even some schools have three sets of toilets because it is so normalized, even among those of younger ages, that there are at least three genders. So around the world, and I'm just going to say this, in virtually every non colonized culture, there were more than two genders. And there were certainly more than two gender expressions. Even if folks were gendered based on their genitalia, if it was based on biological sex, what your underwear had inside it, that there were different types of relationships, different types of expression, um, different ways of dressing, of behaving. It was Western European colonization that had developed a more strict idea of what was appropriate masculine and feminine behavior, and that male and female were only two genders, which was not practiced in ancient Greece or Rome. That came in late Holy Roman Empire. Um, Gender was considered a much more flexible concept in ancient Greece. Um, that with colonization is where the idea of there are only two genders came from. So I think it's very important, particularly when talking to folks from other cultures, because historically, uh, and I say this with some real grief from personal experience, that our Black and Brown communities today can be some of the less embracing of LGBTQIA2S or P individuals. And that is not because historically that was the way. It's because to survive during colonization, assimilation was required for safety. And that has been passed down through generations. It has been internalized by Black and Brown communities. And so, as more white communities may have moved beyond that, may have had the safety and privilege to explore other realities, there is still such a genetic, a mental, a spiritual memory of a lack of safety that enforcing strict behavioral norms that were necessary to keep bodies safe, to keep children and families safe, that's still being practiced in Black and Brown communities right now. Again, I come from the church world. Most major church denominations that are historically white denominations, Episcopalians, Methodists, now Presbyterians, Lutherans, at least have a large number of folks who are LGBTQ inclusive. In historically Black and Latine congregations, there is not one major denomination that is LGBTQIA inclusive. Not one. There are individual congregations, there are individual leaders, but there are no historically Black denominations where LGBTQIA plus people can find spiritual home. And this is also true in non-Christian denominations such as Islam, denominations that we primarily see Black and Brown people in America as part of. This is not the historical reality. If we go back to pre-colonization, the normalization of different styles of relationships and genders were present. They were taken away. And that history is not taught. We do not know why individuals are born lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, even intersex. We do not know what causes those realities. There are multiple scientific theories that are still being tested. It is quite honestly very difficult to get testing dollars and have those studies adequately financed and resourced. But there is enough data to say this really does appear to be a genetic reality. And it is one that, even with attempts to change or alter it in the same way that would be successful if we were talking about a mental illness, a thought pattern, a brain pattern, or a learned behavior, the things that work with learned behaviors do not work with changing a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. They just don't. And so if we have all of these wonderful, well-researched fields that work with behavior modification and that work with shifting thought patterns, and they don't work with LGBTQIA plus people, then the belief is that means we are not talking about behavioral, learned behaviors or thought patterns. We are talking about something that is deeper. You've heard me refer to the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a lovely graphic called the gender unicorn. Some of you may have also seen the genderbread person, who is another fun representation that I'll pull up in a minute so you can see that there's different ways to explain this. But the gender unicorn shows us, you see how the gender unicorn is thinking about their gender identity? That reminds us that gender is what exists in the brain. It is how your brain functions. It is who you know yourself to be in your brain. Whereas the sex you are assigned at birth, we have our little DNA strand. That's where the genitalia would be, right? There is a difference between sex and gender. Sex is what is assigned at birth. It is based on your genitalia. It is based on chromosomes and DNA. The sexes are male and female and intersex or other. These are the three biological and chromosomal realities that affect genitalia, affect hormones, affect physical appearance. Gender identity, which exists in the mind, is what affects thought patterns, affects belief, affects behaviors, affects learning styles, communication styles, ways of being in the world. So our sex and our gender do not necessarily have to be the same. The sex that we are assigned at birth, why we use that assigned at birth is because we recognize that that can be changed through gender confirmation surgery or reassignment surgery. And also that a person's gender identity may not match with the sex they were assigned at birth. They just may be different. A gender identity may be male, female, or it may be non-binary. It may be pangender. There's just a different reality possible with how the mind, how the brain works than what kind of physical reality is there. That's gender, and that is different than we see the little hearts in the middle. That is different than your emotions and your attractions, your heart experience. And so we have those that experience physical attraction and emotional attraction. And we have learned that there is some differentiation there. Sexual orientation is not actually a complete term because there are those who might have sexual attraction, but like our ACE spectrum, our arrow spectrum, you can have sexual activity and interaction without necessarily that romantic attraction, and you can have romantic attraction without necessarily desiring sex to be part of that. So recognizing that regardless of what your gender is, physical attraction and emotional attraction might not be linked to your gender identity. Just because you identify as a man, that doesn't mean you are attracted to women. Your gender identity and who you are physically or emotionally attracted to are not necessarily related. Your gender does not control who you are supposed to be attracted to. So this lovely little happy unicorn here is just a reminder that gender, sex, and attraction are independent things. And if you have a certain gender, it doesn't mean you are supposed to be attracted to someone. So the terminology that you'll hear used, sex assigned at birth or gendered at birth, we assume that someone is male or female. They might have been assigned male or female at birth, but that does not mean that their gender identity is that way. That simply means their sex is that way. We can't ask a child how their brain functions. We don't have reliable tests for it yet for children. But fun fact, the when trans people as adults are interviewed, the average age that they recall realizing something was different about their gender identity is actually approximately 3 or 4 years old. The bulk of trans people, it wasn't puberty that they realized they were trans. It wasn't when they started having sexual intercourse that they realized they were trans, because those hormone rushes have more to do with attraction. Gender is how your brain works. And so, as children are learning their bodies, learning the differences between boys and girls, engaging in activities like toilet training, are learning their names and how to spell their names, are learning basic social behaviors, as they're developing their brains and their sense of identity as separate from their parents and different from their peers, as they're learning those first phases of social interaction, that's actually the most common time for trans individuals to realize the beginnings of that they are trans. They may not have the vocabulary, but they can say, I recognize then going to the bathroom that I felt like I was in the wrong place. When I looked at my body, I knew something was there that didn't belong there. So that's part of how we have realized in the psychology community that gender identity is likely biological and very different from the sexual attraction, because gender identity develops when other markers of identity develop. And a 3 or 4 year old is not responding to being oversaturated by media propaganda. But that's when folks are beginning to realize that they are trans. So the gender unicorn is a fun, helpful way to explain and share that with folks in a way that can be um, a little more invitational and not as challenging, for folks who are, well, I don't understand the difference between this gender, and sexual orientation, and you're using phrases like gendered at birth. Um, One of the other phrases you'll hear me that you've heard me use is cisgender, versus transgender, right? So cisgender being someone who identifies with the gender they were given at birth, transgender, someone who identifies with a gender other than what they were assigned at birth. So we have genders assigned at birth. We have cisgender folks who are like, yep, they were right on point. And we have transgender who are like, nope, that gender assigned at birth was not actually helpful. And so those are uh, terms that you'll hear used quite a bit. And you'll also hear some of the phrases like gender confirmation surgery, or gender affirming surgery, and gender affirming or gender confirming hormones and treatment. So these are medical terminologies, right? That we don't say sex change surgery anymore. Generally, um, we do not necessarily use the phrase, you know, well, any related phrases to, well, we just, they changed their sex, they got the surgery, um, they're getting they're getting the hormones, right? We instead use phrases like confirmation or affirmation, if that is helpful. And one of the other graphics that's very popular that I'll just show you briefly, the genderbread person, um, also breaks down identity versus attraction versus sex. And then the expression is how you dress and how you act and some of your movements, your speech style, that kind of thing. Expression is what's external versus what's internal. Your attraction and your identity are internal. And again, just because you dress differently than one might expect, that doesn't make you trans. You may just like wearing clothes that are traditionally seen on the opposite gender. Because you behave in a certain way, um, you speak with a certain set of mannerisms, that doesn't necessarily determine your attraction. So a lot of the harassment, a lot of the challenges that have been that people have been exposed to, so a lot of the bullying, a lot of the stereotypes have more to do with gender expression, um, have more to do with a personal expression, um, and assumptions being made about an individual's identity or attraction based on what their expression is. But our expressions are external. Our identity and our attraction are internal. And you cannot tell what someone's identity or attraction is because of how they dress, because of how they speak, because of what gestures they use. And so that is the kind of separation that can be helpful to lift up. There is not a way of dressing that is gay. There is not a way of speaking that is gay, um, because those are expression, and being gay is an attraction, right? There's not a way of dressing. There's not a certain set of toys that are boy toys. How many of us have gone through, gotten the Happy Meal and they're like, do you want the girl Happy Meal or the boy Happy Meal? I just want a cheeseburger, right? Whether it's a Barbie or a Hot Wheel is not going to change my child's identity. You are absolutely allowed to play with whatever toys you want. That's expression, it's external. Identity is internal. So, as we discussed a little bit earlier, some of these statistics are actually updated in exciting ways. And this new Gallup poll that just came out does show that we are now actually up to 9.3% of Americans that are identifying as LGBT or something other than heterosexual. And one of the big things that we are noticing is that there is a very consistent raise in the numbers of overall Americans that bisexual is actually the fastest growing, which is not one of our, newest and most trending categories, but that bisexuals were much easier to not be visible in community because many bisexual individuals might be in, quote unquote, straight passing relationships. You can't tell from someone's lifestyle, from someone's partner or marriage, whether or not they're bisexual. And so, for self protection and um, safety, job security, it's very possible that a lot of individuals who were bisexual might have even known they were bisexual, did not report as such. Maybe they hadn't disclosed that to their partner. They didn't want it coming out in their medical records or files, etc. Or they just weren't aware because there wasn't as much ability to explore and have conversation if you were in a relationship that appeared to be heterosexual or a straight relationship. Um, but the embracing of the idea of queer community, that you can be, for example, a woman who is married to a man and still be perfectly valid as bisexual, um, and be part of the queer community, that is something that wasn't always affirmed, right? There was such a level of stigma, and it led to a level of defensiveness. There were folks like, well, I don't get to choose. I don't get to turn it off. I'm in this gay marriage or this gay partnership. I'm in this transgender body and reality. And so our bi siblings were not always treated as with the same inclusive respect and care. There was in the LGBTQ community not as much acceptance. And for example, men who were more masculine, who could quote unquote pass, or women who were more feminine and could pass, there was almost an internalized sense of oppression that the LGBTQ community would be less accepting of some of those individuals in certain places or spaces because, well, I don't have the option of passing, right? So I'm not going to paint a picture saying that all LGBTQIA plus people we have always been loving and accepting of each other, nurturing and supportive of each other. There has been oppression of lesbians when the predominantly gay male visual society was more of our media face because women, up until the 70s and 80s, still didn't have the ability to do things like get banking credit lines for starting their own businesses and being able to purchase property. You know, there just have been wonderful lesbian presses, magazines, etc. But there wasn't the same financial access and opportunity for the same level of visibility. And so part of lesbian advocacy has been not just recognition in society, but also recognition and voice in the LGBTQIA plus community. Because when women had less access to financial security, had less access to business, banking resources, credit and financing, property ownership, there were fewer places and spaces that centered lesbian needs and realities. And there were very different layers of oppression when you had two women in a household, when you had an all women community um, that just didn't have the same access and opportunity that communities that had lots of men that were able to bring different levels of resource and privilege into the space. And so lesbians have had to advocate in the LGBTQIA plus community for their own visibility and voice. Same with bisexual individuals. And yes, there has very much been LG and B individuals who have not been as welcoming of transgender individuals as well. And so the trans community has really had to fight for their space in LGBTQIA plus spaces, as well as in cisgender or heterosexual spaces. So the only reason I point that out, you know, when you're in survival mode, we don't all bring our best selves to the table when we're in survival mode. We can be defensive. That's a reality. But it is also important to remember that there may be fewer places and spaces for someone to receive support than we would assume as allies. So if someone is bisexual, if someone is transgender, if someone is lesbian, they may have additional needs. They may have additional areas of challenge, and there may be a reluctance to engage in LGBTQIA plus spaces or certain organizations. They may have experienced harm or exclusion in those organizations, as well as in straight spaces or cisgender spaces. So being aware that the community is layered and complex. And that's why we again engage in the art of the ask. We honor people's truths and we respect their realities. And so you can very easily Google, it is a Gallup poll. So the 2025 Gallup poll on LGBTQ realities in America will give you access to the latest information and recognizing that Gen Z, or those born in 1997 through 2006, now 23.1% identify as something other than straight. 23.1%. That's a big number. And that millennials born in 81 through 96, 14.2%. Why do I lift this up in addition to just recognizing that the numbers are increasing. Because if we are thinking about wanting to do relevant youth outreach, if we're thinking about wanting to work with younger people, if we have certain demographics um, that we are targeting with advertising, with programming, if we have nearly a quarter of the population identifying as non straight, if we're doing programming that centers around reaching Gen Z folks, we better make sure that we are specifically naming LGBTQIA plus inclusion and welcome. We need to put pronouns on those name tags. We need to make sure that forms have fill in the blank for gender as opposed to a drop down box where only male or female or a distasteful other is the only option. We need to be looking at our registration materials. We need to be looking at our cultural competency training. We need to be making sure that we're holding space for chosen names as opposed to assuming that the name on the identification or registration form is what the individual uses. We want to make sure that we're avoiding the use of overly gendered language. Hey guys, um, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the space, right? You've noticed that you've heard me use words instead of saying brothers and sisters. That's a favorite church one. I say siblings. Instead of greetings, ladies and gentlemen, I say welcome, my esteemed colleagues, welcome, friends. Um, when asking non binary, trans, LGBTQ individuals, especially youth, what made them feel welcome in a space? The first things that have always been mentioned are one, respectful use of pronouns and the ability to, without a lot of stigma, without having to correct people or without having to open themselves for attack, having some space for just proactively naming pronouns. So, using name tags, having a space to write your pronouns on table tents, on tables, standardizing putting your pronouns after your name when introducing yourself, going around the table, adding pronouns to your Zoom screen name, adding pronouns to your email signature. As many ways as you can normalize pronouns and invite others to normalize the use of pronouns, that means we don't have individuals having to put themselves out there to advocate for pronouns in a space that may be unfriendly. Also, using name tags, even in spaces where people know each other, because that gives us a place to put pronouns and chosen names out there and to reinforce them and to help make it easier for folks who may be afraid of making a mistake. Name tags and pronouns in writing can really help people feel more comfortable and at ease utilizing them, and also feel a little bit of extra encouragement to use them because when we see something written, when something is put out there, we are much less likely to go against it. So if someone has a name tag that has their chosen name, their pronoun listed on it, they are much more likely to have that respected in the space. Someone's not going to say, well, I'm going to just use a different name or pronoun compared to something that's right in front of them as frequently as they will if there's nothing that's actually written down. So, looking at our forms, looking at our labels, our name tents, our Zoom screens, our email signatures, as many places as we can reinforce that we affirm and respect pronouns out there as possible, absolutely a helpful thing. Also, gender inclusive language, using words like siblings instead of brothers and sisters, using homies, friends, compadres, uh, allies, comrades. Have fun with it. But rather than using phrases like ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, men and women, try to use more open and inclusive phrases when adjusting groups. And that also is helpful when naming programs, instead of, girls club, instead of having the women's group or the women's luncheons. Um, if there's a reason for gendered programming, if it is really specifically about creating a particular kind of safe space, great. But if it's simply tradition, if it's just what has always been done, not as helpful. And if we want to make sure that that space is inclusive, this is a women's luncheon, but it is inclusive. We want trans women there. We want non-binary folks who are comfortable in a women's space there. We need to say that, um, because there is a difference between those who are gendered female at birth and women. So if trans women, if non-binary folks would show up and not be welcome, and there'd be lots of jokes and language, etc., let's find ways to be clearer about that and to be intentional about the welcome. If we're saying this is an event for women or for men, let's recognize that those who fall under that label, as women or men, might have very different realities. And let's make sure that we're using appropriate language and naming that. And that also, if we are offering safe spaces for men and women, are we offering safe spaces for non-binary folks? If we have Women's Health Month, if we have Women's History Month, are we offering spaces to educate around the challenges non-binary folks go through during Pride Month, perhaps? Are we having a National Coming Out Day programming, October being LGBTQIA plus History Month? Are we making sure that we're also offering comparable spaces, information, and resources in other times and spaces, so that if we still want to keep our male and our female resources, we do have balance? That's very much helpful and has been asked for. So where can we go in terms of figuring out who do we partner with? Who do we work with? Well, one of the organizations in Pennsylvania that is a great partner is the Pennsylvania Youth Congress. And Pennsylvania Youth Congress is an organization that is not only about youth advocacy and young adult advocacy, but they are a wonderful compiler of resources and information. So, for example, this is the Pennsylvania Youth Congress website, and it has a lovely interactive map chart of LGBTQIA plus resource organizations in Pennsylvania. Did we know that there were arts organizations that were very specifically targeting LGBTQ individuals? That there were specific advocacy organizations, athletic associations, that there's commissions and governmental offices where we can get updates around laws and regulations? Turns out that there are. As a former commissioner on the Pennsylvania Commission on LGBTQ Affairs, I can say that there are absolutely mailing lists and helpful resources to make sure that we have the access for supportive information. So the Pennsylvania Youth Congress, if you go to payyouthcongress.org/directory, or you just go to the main page and look for the directory, you can absolutely get access to all of the different organizations that exist in Pennsylvania. Almost all of them have regional organizers, have individuals that you can invite to come and speak to you personally, to do presentations and either Zoom in or come in person classes, organizational presentations, etc. Wonderful resources that are out there. We also have some fabulous advocacy groups that are doing work on the national level. I'm a big fan of the Trevor Project, because the Trevor Project supports mental health and suicide, self-harm, and mental health challenges working with youth. And they are also one of the best gatherers of statistics and data in the nation. They use peer-reviewed, vetted research, and they have downloadable PowerPoints. So going to the Trevor Project um, website will get you a great deal of access to information. One of the others that is my favorite is the HRC. That's a national organization, and I want to spend some time with the HRC because one of their wonderful resources is, well, how do organizations practice allyship? What are ways that a nonprofit or a business um, or an institution can really be an active ally, even if the individuals in it are not all? Well, according to the HRC, these are their 6 pillars of what allyship, or as they refer to it as corporate citizenship, look like. The first one is looking at your workforce. What challenges exist? What are the barriers to employment and the barriers to longitudinal successful employment exist in your organization? This has been an issue for things like medical insurance, offering parental leave for adoptive parents, as well as biological birthing parents. Perhaps it's benefits for domestic partners, as well as for partners who are able to access legal marriage. That was a large issue before legal marriage was passed for LGBTQ individuals. Whether there is just in your cultural competency, in your paperwork, the ability to use, again, chosen names, pronouns, inclusive language. Um, what are the barriers in your workplace for LGBTQ folks to feel safe? What are the barriers for finding community and supportive individuals? Are there mentorship partnerships? Is there frequent representation in leadership of LGBTQ individuals so that there's a clear ability to advance, that there's examples of folks who are able to be seen in visible positions that are LGBTQIA plus, right? So what are those particular barriers in the workforce and how might you begin dismantling them? Another is supply chains, right? Are you utilizing materials from LGBTQIA plus businesses or members of LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, right? Are your partners LGBTQIA plus inclusive? Looking at who you're contracting with, who you're purchasing from, who you're working with makes a statement and also builds helpful relationships. The products and services that you are sharing, marketing techniques. Are you advertising and sponsoring community events that are culturally related, that are in other local connections in your communities, but you're not marketing, you're not tabling at the local pride? You're not necessarily engaged with the local LGBTQ newspaper or on different websites. You're not sponsoring or making donations to LGBTQ organizations or dropping off swag bags, things that advertise what you do at local LGBTQ events or meetups, right? There's lots of ways to help get yourself out there in LGBTQI plus gathering spaces or celebrations, or even opening your own space to groups that might not have a place to meet, right? How are you reaching out and connecting, having one-on-ones, having meetings with leaders in the LGBTQIA plus community? Marketing is about relationship building. And so even if you don't have a huge marketing budget, how are you making yourself known? You could do that simply by inviting the chairperson or the executive director of local prides, local youth groups, going to visit schools and that have a GSA and meeting with that teacher, asking, even if it's dropping off boxes of snacks that you put your organizational sticker on for the kids at the GSA after school. All that is marketing. Corporate philanthropy is something you may or may not have influence on, but encouraging frequently the ability to even make the suggestion, partnering with prides, LGBTQ centers, medical initiatives, research studies, publications, sponsoring speakers to come into local school districts, sponsoring speakers to come in to local congregations, finding ways to partner with other organizations to create edification events. A wonderful event that some of our corporations were able to take part of just a few months ago that I was able to be present for was bringing in multiple documentaries from LGBTQIA plus filmmakers in partnership with a local independent theater. And so having the corporate sponsorship partnered with the theater was able to hold an LGBTQIA plus film fest. And that film fest was beautiful advertising and an example of corporate philanthropy for folks that would not have normally had access to these films, right? And partnered with a local business and built that relationship and got some great visibility and media coverage. And then we also have advocacy and political engagement. And I want to think about that for us on the micro level as well as the macro level, right? A lot of beautiful change can be done at school board meetings, at city, township, and borough council meetings, um, rather than at the national level, right? It's great if you organize people together and you all go together to get to DC and march on the Capitol. But I have seen votes change at a 5-person borough council meeting, at a school board meeting. Letters being circulated, petitions being circulated, letters to the editor, um, or letters to local officials that can come from the organizations, or from members and participants in your programs. These are all advocacy, right? Even contributing and doing voter registration drives, which as nonprofits, we can absolutely do get out the vote because it is nonpartisan. Doing get out the vote at LGBTQ events, being in places and spaces where LGBTQ people are and encouraging voter registration and participation, absolutely helpful. We do not have to pick an individual candidate to advocate for human rights protections and bills and laws. Pennsylvania Youth Congress also has a wonderful, continually updated page on what are current bills and things that are happening politically in the House and in the Pennsylvania Senate. So we can find ways to get involved on that local level. But I have absolutely seen just a few people attending a school board meeting or a township or borough council meeting change the way that votes went in a way that might not happen on the larger level. But that is something that you can organize individuals to do here. So these are all things to be aware of. And I will put that for those that are live is in the chat there. And some of the other health disparities, and I'm aware that this is a little bit harder to see, but I'll also voice it for folks that as much as 57% of folks who are in the LGBTQIA plus community have been diagnosed with depression. Um, 31% of LGBT women 40 years and older had never had a mammogram, right? The going in for healthcare treatment um, and seeing gynecologists for women who do not traditionally experience penetration or who might feel uncomfortable with certain people handling their bodies means that quite a few lesbians do not go in for as much regular gynecological care, mammograms, internal exams, pap smears, which can cause harm there, right? Trans patients who often do not feel comfortable disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity to their doctors may not describe at risk behaviors, but also the lack of support and challenge. It does lead to a lot of higher mental health incidents and challenges. 33% of LGBT youth have practiced self harm, right? Transgender people that are 18 are 11 times more likely to have experienced self harm, right? That LGBTQ youth and young people between 16 and 27, 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. The bullying, the effects of bullying, the effects of a lack of recognition, the effects of a lack of support from family, from educators, from faith communities, from therapists, doctors, counselors, from educators in outside of school spaces, dance classes, sports teams. There are so many spaces that particularly young people, youth, and young adults are exposed to um, that what it causes in mental health harm, the lack of affirmation and acceptance is incalculable. Higher rates of depression, anxiety, self harm, suicidal ideation, attempts, and completed suicide are all just significantly escalated in the LGBTQIA plus community. But there is good news, right? The good news is that even one supportive adult can significantly reduce that risk. So the deep necessity of making sure that we are um, sharing that we are safer people, that we have some sort of visible representation. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. Welcome statements. And I remember I told you there's three things that come up most frequently: the use of pronouns and the respect of those pronouns, the use of gender inclusive language, and also public affirmation, specified naming of being a welcoming and inclusive space, whether that is putting up a flag, whether that is using a welcome statement, including inclusion and celebration of LGBTQIA plus individuals in an outreach statement, a welcoming sign, putting that somewhere on websites, on windows, on office doors. People do not assume they are welcome. It must be specifically named somewhere. And a visible representation of that is important. But people know us. They know I'm a safe person. If it's not visually, publicly recognized, there is not that assumption that you will show up consistently. You might show up in quiet, private places, but if you're not willing to wear the t shirt, put the sticker up, put the flag out, then you may or may not be able to be counted on in public spaces or when under stress. And so that uh, making a public demonstration, even if it's just a small decal on a window or door, a bumper sticker, um, a t shirt, a bracelet, or a pin that is worn, but some symbol, some statement that clearly names LGBTQIA plus or clearly indicates LGBTQIA plus, saying like all are welcome, we serve all people, we're an inclusive space, we celebrate diversity is not enough. That has too often been misused or not followed up on. It has been too often not inclusive of LGBTQIA plus individuals. So I invite you, I implore you to think about as you sort of do an audit of your a mental audit of your spaces, of your workplaces. Are there visual representations of LGBTQIA plus inclusion? Are there welcome statements? Is there some expressed and explicit indicator of welcome? Have you looked at your forms, your outward facing intake materials, brochures, sign-ups, the vocabulary that is used in registrations or taking histories, and then also in your databases where information is stored. Do you have a place to record this information so that folks are not forced to give their information over and over and over again? Is there some place where it's easily findable if you're moving from one caregiver to another? Can there be a way that that information is transferred, or at least that it is reliably asked for in new spaces, so that you don't have to go through the coming out process in one group or one classroom or with one professional or one administrator and then have to do it again and again and again, 3 and 4 times to access services throughout a day? Right? How is this information transferring? It can be as simple as name tags. So every time you walk into a room, bam, it's there. But it can also be in intake paperwork. It can be in changing the normalization of using pronouns when introducing ourselves. So I am going to stop there. There's plenty more we could talk about in terms of all the many different neo-pronouns, all the many different terminologies, and all of the different realities around identities and different laws. But the truth is, a lot of those laws, a lot of those areas of safety, a lot of the resource organizations that are available are very different by county, by age group, and by organization. So, what I would again implore, ask, and encourage you is to look at your own constitutions, your own charters, your own policies, procedures, manuals. What does the inclusive language practice look like? What does your own programming around gendered language look like? Go through on your own website, do a scroll through on the website. Look at the relationship tips or the pictures of couples and families that are hung in the hallways. What do they look like? Where is language, representation, or practice of inclusion happening? And where could it be happening? We start with educating ourselves, with educating our colleagues, raising awareness, and then also finding points of action that are frequently inexpensive and highly accessible. But what they are is intentional, and they are expanding to a wider welcome of individuals.